Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore and Eastern Antique Arms. Now, all of you, I would imagine, watching this video know what a tulwar or talwar is. It's one of the most iconic sword designs from history, from any culture. And if you don't know, well, now you know. And it's very important that you do know what a talwar is. Let's talk about what it is in a second, but this typical kind of tulwar has a curved blade and most characteristically a disc pommel, okay? But usually they have this kind of setup. Sometimes they have knuckle bows, sometimes that's this bit, sometimes they don't, but they pretty much always have this type of crossguard with differing styles of knob on the end, usually some languettes coming up the side there which grip either side of the scabbard, and as I say, a disc pommel, and usually some kind of projection in the middle of the grip. Now, what actually is a talwar or tulwar? Well, simply the word just means sword. Now, I was talking with my good friend Matt Ford, shout out to Matt Ford here, about how problematic it is when we're talking about Indian weapons, when we start using terminologies such as tulwar or pata, dand pata, faringi, susan pata, patisa, tega, all of these many different words for different types of Indian sword. Now the problem, the elephant in the room, is that a lot of those words are applied to different types of swords at different times, and sometimes there are two different words you could use for the same sword. And the problem with the word tulwar is that whilst we all know in the modern world pretty much that this sort of thing is what we would call a tulwar, the word talwar just means sword, okay? So it's a bit like when I talk about medieval and Renaissance Europe, I point out the fact that long swords, for example, were just known as swords pretty much, or sometimes they were known as two-handed swords, sometimes sword of war, and you know, even something like a rapier was usually in Italy, a rapier was just called spada, which just means sword. So very often when we're talking about historical periods, and bear in mind that not everyone living at a given time in a general region of the world necessarily had the same understanding of what that word meant. For example, the word pulwar and the word tulwar. We all know in the modern world when we're talking about a pulwar, we're talking about a sword from Afghanistan with a different style of pommel on it, but fundamentally similar to this. But the word pulwar is the same as the word tulwar. It's just a different language's version of the same word. It gets very problematic. So coming back to the tulwar, this is usually what we accept it to be, and it is an absolutely iconic sword of India, and in many ways this is thought of as the typical Indian sword. But we have to remember one very important thing. Tulwars, these types of swords, so when I say tulwar from now on in the video, I'm talking specifically about this sort of format of sword. Tulwars actually only become common in about the kind of 15th, 16th century. Okay, prior to that, there are different types of swords which are prevalent in India. Many of them straight bladed, many of them forward curved, but this type of backwards curved blade really became popular, really popular from the 16th century onwards, almost certainly connected with the Mughals and generally kind of Islamic influence coming into the subcontinent, as it were. And the other thing to remember as well when we talk about a country, so India wasn't really necessarily, we could say it was one land, one region, but of course it was divided up into lots of different cultures, religions, languages, dialects, and some of them had very distinctive weapons. The Marathas have distinctive weapons compared to the Mughals, for example, and you find different styles of sword are more or less prevalent in different parts of India. Right, so this is the standard format of tulwar, and we pretty much always expect it to have a curved blade, don't we? Now, I've pointed out in some previous videos that there are Indian tulwars which have European blades, okay? Now, a few people dispute that any European blades were used on Indian swords. Well, it's incredibly well documented. You just go and get any book on Indian arms and armour and you will find verification of this fact. It's not just me saying it, it's every museum curator and expert on this subject in the world. Okay, so European blades were definitely imported into India. Not to say because they were better, but because Germany in particular was very good at mass producing blades and exporting them all over the world. They were, for example, the Sudanese Cascara. It's a sword from the Sudan. Nothing, you wouldn't think there's anything connecting the Sudan and Germany in particular, but there is one thing, and that is their sword blades. And a lot of Sudanese Cascara carry German broadsword blades that were made specifically for that purpose and exported, and presumably they got things in return, be it money or other things, resources that they wanted from that region. So blades were traded into India, probably because the Germans in particular, some other people in Europe, but mostly the Germans, were particularly good at mass producing blades and selling them relatively affordably. They're obviously manufactured in a slightly different way, and they have a slightly different style. And the ways that we can tell that they are European blades are either, well, both. There are two main ways. One is the style of them, so we can see that they are not an Indian style of blade. We can see that they are a European export style of saber blade, usually saber, sometimes broadsword, very occasionally rapier. And sometimes they have markings on them which are European armourers' markings, and you get Indian swords with blades with the word Solingen written up them, as I've shown before in previous videos. Now, what I want to talk about is the tulwar. So when we talk about the tulwar, we expect this type of hilt and a curved type of blade, and the curved types of blades come in different styles. You can get a sort of generic sabre blade, a bit like this, a bit like you'd find on a European 17th century dusak, for example. This is very, very similar blade to that. You can find some blades which are more like the Turkish kilich or pala, and you can also find some blades which are more like the shamshir, the sort of Persian and should we say Middle Eastern, North African style of curved blade, which tapers towards the tip, which again I've shown in previous videos. So you get different styles of curved blade with these types of tulwar hilts. But there is yet another type of blade you get on this. In fact, there are many blades you get on these tulwar hilts. You do get even things like kukri blades. You get Suzan pata blades, which are forwards curved, a little bit like a yataghan. You will even find Khyber knife type chada blades mounted on tulwar hilts. But here I have a new example, and that's why mainly why I'm doing this video now. And you do get these. So what is this? Well, this is a European backsword blade. So this is an 18th century, what probably originally was intended to go on what we would perhaps call a dragoon backsword. A heavy cavalry palash, essentially, a heavy cavalry sword. Now, let's just grab the tape measure here and measure this up for you, because I know you like weights and measures. So the blade is 34.5 inches long, so between 87 and 88 centimeters. So relatively long, not crazy long. And the width on the blade at the base of the blade is just under 1.5 inches, or around 3.5 centimeters wide. So it's a fairly big blade, but it's got ferocious distal taper. That is, it starts off not hugely thick actually at the base, maybe about 6 millimeters, and it goes down to really, really thin. Okay, so you can see I can flex it. So it's got a very thin foible, as we'd call it, the end part of the blade here. And as a result, it's, quite a quick, nimble blade. Now this is unquestionably, from the style of it, it's got no markings on it that I can see, but this is unquestionably, from the method of manufacture and the style of the blade, a European backsword blade. This is exactly what you'd find on a basket hilt or a half basket hilt from Europe, probably between about, let's say, 1720 and 1780, probably. Okay, so we're talking about the middle section of the 1700s, aka the 18th century. And as I say, this would normally be on a basket hilt. Now these sorts of blades, obviously the 18th century was an incredibly important time in Indian history for contact with Europe, because really the 18th century probably saw what we would describe as the kind of explosion of trade contact with Europe. Obviously, most famously Britain, with the Honourable East India Company, John Company, and that led eventually to the Raj and Empire and everything else. But you've got to bear in mind, in the 18th century, it wasn't quite until 1757, and even after that, there were parts of India which were very much under other European kind of trading influence and, in some cases, political and military influence. France was, you know, a power that had influence in India. The Netherlands, the Dutch East India Company, and also prior to that, Portugal and Spain, particularly down in the south. So European powers had started really getting a foothold in India, both in terms of trading with India, in other words, selling to and buying from, and also political and military influence that obviously, as we know, led to the colonialist kind of end goal. But it started out pretty much more as trade. And so as a result, there are many, many ways that European blades like this British backsword blade could have ended up in India in the 18th century. Or for all we know, this blade may have already been old by the time it ended up being re-hilted with an Indian hilt. So we don't really know whether the blade itself was just imported into India and then it was, you know, hilted up with a local Indian Tulwar style hilt, or if the sword was originally mounted on a basket hilt and then that was taken off and replaced with a local hilt. Now, there's a few other questions which come from this. One thing I'll mention is that there was clearly a preference for some Europeans to carry Indian swords. And there are many reasons why you know, Indian style swords would have been worn by Europeans, obviously partly maybe diplomatic, just kind of you know, wearing the clothes of the locals, as it were, and in some cases effectiveness, because they thought they were really good. But one of the questions that comes up with this arrangement, should we say an Indian hilt, particularly a Tulwar hilt with a straight blade, is why were these two things married together in this particular case? You know, I've spoken about the usefulness of these disc pommels previously, and the fact that they, just swap over to the curved one, they facilitate or encourage, should we say, the drawing cut. Now, that's not to say that a straight blade can't make the drawing cut. In fact, it can. It just chops slightly more than a curved blade does, because it's essentially projecting forward of the line of the arc, as it were. But we know that some people did prefer straight blades, some people preferred forwards curved blades. The Susan Pata, for example, is a forwards curved blade, and in fact this probably is more closely related to earlier swords that we find in India, and this, you know, this was obviously a forwards curved blade. It's even more exaggerated in that chopping effect than a straight blade is. But more usually, I'll just grab this example here, we see straight blades mounted on other types of hilts, usually either a pata type hilt, as seen here, or on the basket hilt that I've shown before, that I've had examples of. I don't actually have one at the moment. And so therefore the straight blade is usually coupled with a different type of hilt, not usually with a Tulwar hilt. So that's why this makes this particularly interesting to me. And there is a connection to a famous character from Indian history, a certain Brigadier General John Nicholson. And we know that John Nicholson was given his choice of sword by the Sikhs, and essentially he chose, it's specifically mentioned, he chose a straight blade, but in the pictures of him we can see it's got an Indian hilt. So it does seem that this is sort of similar perhaps to the sort of sword, probably with a knuckle bow according to the pictures that we've got, that John Nicholson would have carried. So some people did prefer these, and obviously you've got better thrusting potential if you want to, and even though you've got a disc on the pommel, you can see that you can switch the grip to be able to use the point. That's no problem. You've also got slightly better reach with a straight blade, and you have a slightly more chopping effect, as I mentioned, not quite as much as with the forwards curved blade, but more so than perhaps with the curved backwards blade. So some people preferred these, as we can see with this example. The one thing I'll just finish up with saying is that, falling over swords there. One thing I'll finish up with saying is that these swords were generally, I believe, known as Ferengi or Ferengi, which means foreign, coming from the word Frankish. And it came into India and described swords that had foreign, particularly European, blades. And so this, although we could call this a Tulwar with a backsword blade, I believe that in period this probably would have been known simply as a Ferengi, because it's not an Indian style blade. Although it's an Indian style hilt, It's a European style blade. Anyway, hope that's been somewhat interesting and useful. I might feature this sword again in future videos. If you found this interesting, give me a like, subscribe if you're interested in seeing more videos like this, and I've got extra videos on Patreon as well. Thanks for watching, folks. Cheers. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.